We're joined by Doug Henwood. He is an editor over at Left Business Observer and is the host of Behind the News. His latest in Jacobin is our lead essay in the new print issue, and it's titled, "Take Me to Your Leader, The Rot of the American Ruling Class." Doug, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, talk to us about the rot in the American ruling class and how it's different. I was listening to one of your interviews, and you did kind of talk about how much the situation has devolved in recent years. So, talk about how rotten that rot has really gotten.
Well, I guess the point of comparison for this is the WASPs who ruled America from founding really, but they had their heyday from the late 19th century into the mid to late 20th. They were brutal, they were racist, they were imperialist, they were awful in so many ways, but there was a coherence to them, and they're able to manage the system for the long term in a way that was stable and at least concerned with keeping things going beyond the next quarterly earnings report. I think since then, they've been replaced by people are driven largely by money. We have a ruling class that doesn't have any kind of internal social coherence, but is just trying to maximize its wealth, and they let the society rot. They've gotten very wealthy. They've unimaginably, unprecedentedly rich. I guess you could look back to the late 19th century of the Gilded Age as a precedent, but the Gilded Age guys tried to civilize themselves after a while into the early 20th century. These people are just, I think, vulgar, brutal, and just utterly selfish, and that's a good bit of the reason why the whole country seems to be falling apart physically and socially. It's just driven by maximizing their profit in the shortest term without any regard for the consequences over the longer term.
Yeah, the old WASP patricians, like you said, were awful, but they all kind of knew each other. They all hung out at the same social clubs. Their scions went to school together, and they did have a little bit of what we would call noblesse oblige, and that has kind of gone by the wayside entirely. When did that change, and how did that change?
Well, several things happened. First of all, any kind of elite tends to rot over time. George Gilder had a funny passage. George Gilder, who came out of that class, was a liberal Republican in the 70s, turned to the right, and became a thinker for the Reagan administration. But he has some funny bits about how, the first generation, they make money. The second generation, they endow their philanthropies. And by the third generation, they're just like a bunch of drug-taking hippies and artists. But also, you had this, the WASP fortunes got old. They got divided by successive waves of inheritance. They got undermined by inflation. The kinds of companies that they used to run, the old industrial heartland of the United States, started weakening in the 70s, so that they lost that material basis of their wealth. And then starting in the early 1980s, we saw this rise of a whole new generation of just money-driven entrepreneurs, the cowboys of Wall Street in the early 80s, who disrupted the entire sweet arrangement that had been set up in the golden years of the 50s and 60s, and really got unprecedentedly rich. Forbes started publishing its lists of the richest 400 people, 400 families in the U.S. back in 1982, and then I think the minimum price of admission was about $300 million. Now you can't even get on without billions and billions. The amount of money that came in at the top of the society was remarkable. And then we had this geographical shift from the WASP based in the Northeast, New England, New York area, some outposts in places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, even to a degree San Francisco. You saw this shift towards Texas, Southern California, the Sun Belt Revolution. So there was that geographic shift that undermined WASP power. The Republican Party, too, was once the natural political expression of that class. And the right began to try to take over that party in the 1950s, but were not really successful until Reagan was elected president in 1980. But you saw the erosion of that traditional moderate republicanism of Eisenhower, the Northeast, Chase Bank, all those sort of pinnacles or foundations of WASP power really eroded. And you ended up with this extremely right-wing form in the Republican Party. And a loss of any of that sense of what the WASP would call stewardship. That the idea that you're just a custodian of property for the next generation, that didn't fit with the ethic of all these cowboy capitalists.
So in the 1970s, there was this dramatic shift in the business class, and Rick Perlstein calls this business class the boardroom Jacobins. And in order to really understand that, you got to understand the Powell Memorandum. Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, a lot of things went on in the 70s that laid the groundwork for the move to the right. The Powell Memorandum, I think that was 1971 or so, and he wrote it to the people at the Chamber of Commerce, which was a very old-style business organization that had sort of gone out of favor. It has since reinvented itself to be a pinnacle of very right-wing business lobbying. But in those days, it was kind of sleepy and forgotten. But Powell was concerned about the general anti-capitalist feeling throughout American society, that we had become disrespectful of business. There was just no respect for our betters. And then to some degree, they thought that they were helping to finance it, that the universities that they helped fund were teaching communism or anarchism. And Powell tried to organize the members of his class to do something about it. And people pay a lot of attention to that particular memo as an important moment in this shift. But there are a lot of other things going on as well. The business class really began organizing in the mid-70s in ways that they hadn't before. They were disturbed by labor militancy. People forget, the idea that the 70s were this time of bad music and bad hairdos and leisure suits, but it was also a time of a lot of labor militancy. There were a lot of wildcat strikes in the early 70s. There's a lot of concern after the U.S. lost the Vietnam War that we were losing our imperial edge. So there was a lot of alarm at the top of the society that things were really slipping out of their control, and the idea that inflation was really one of their major concerns. But I think you need a broader understanding of inflation than just an atmosphere of generally rising prices. It's also just the sense that things were slipping out of control, out of elite control. Workers are developing an attitude. There's a famous GM plant in Lordstown, Ohio, where the workers were getting high in the job and damaging the equipment and sabotaging the assembly line. There's a sense that America needed a good talking to, and that's when the business class really began organizing and pushing a much more conservative crackdown agenda. Now, I should emphasize that capitalists aren't always really good at organizing themselves politically. It's unusual that they do, in fact. They really need to be organized by political figures, political parties, statespeople. Most capitalists are just so interested in money that they can't really think about how to organize politically. They have some instinctive reactions. They know what they do and don't like. But this was an unusual instance where the capitalist class really organized itself to promote a political counter-revolution. And I must say it was highly successful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you talk about how that the sort of shareholder revolution that became the fashion in the 1980s and things like that led to this thinking, this extreme kind of obsession with money, but also just the obsession with the next quarterly earnings report, and it's led to today where the ruling class seems more discredited than it has in a long time, and this is leading to all kinds of social upheaval. Obviously, there's I think you can explain the rise of right-wing populists all over the world largely as a result of the ruling class's lack of legitimacy. And obviously, we on the left don't like the ruling class. We don't like them to be popular or have legitimacy, but we don't want them to enjoy prestige. But it also creates all these kind of social problems. I think that the rise of the anti-vaxxers and things like that are a result of the ruling class's lack of crisis of legitimacy and like lack of trust in institutions and things like that. What are some of the other bad effects of this kind of crisis of legitimacy?
Well, I think one of the important things, if we had a serious ruling class, I think they would be much more concerned about the climate crisis. Now, there's some signs that they are moving in that direction recently, but the degree of this crisis and its threat to humanity and life on Earth is so dramatic. But they seem, either uninterested in talking about it or uninterested in doing anything about it. And I would think a serious ruling class would be able to deal with it in ways that would preserve their power and their system. But in, at least taking some cognizance of the fact that we're really facing a mortal danger to life itself. But there's just all this sense that, everything is falling apart. That until we have our socialist revolution and the proletariat controls everything, society is, as hierarchical as ours. If you have a problem at the top end, there's going to be some serious disorganization. And this could be productive. It does leave us an opening. They seem very confused at this point, and not really. And as you say, they've really lost a lot of legitimacy. Which is remarkable because, you go back to the 80s and the 90s was a time when, the 80s, they were really earning some kind of legitimacy because that was the time when the entrepreneur was heroized. And then in the 90s, Bill Clinton really helped consolidate those gains by, sanctifying the Wall Street frame of mind, that whole new Democrat era where they were really going to be tough imperialists, but also very Wall Street friendly. And now that all seems like a really distant memory, that Wall Street, everybody wants to get rich by buying Bitcoin now. But, the business class does not have that prestige that it did in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of people are just bitter and alienated and really sick of working really hard if they can find a job at all for pennies. And
right.
I think there's just a rising level of disgust and alienation and anger. The elites don't seem really to know what to do about it. You have perhaps some reformist turn among some of them, but they really like their privilege and don't want to give it up.
Right. I mean, when you talk about how much the mood has changed among American workers, you can see it in the media and what does well for entertainment. I mean, the era of Pimp My Ride and MTV Cribs, it's over. People are not interested. I think that's part of the reason why, reality shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians probably got off the air. But, one thing that is very noticeable is just how much the Democratic Party has increasingly become the party representing the elite class. And, I think it's become abundantly clear that the Roosevelt brand of Democrats doesn't really exist anymore. This is really more about protecting business interests as opposed to looking out for the best interests of either constituents or the working class.
Well, I'd say several things about that. One, it's interesting to look at different factions of the ruling class. So there's a certain portion that is the funding base for Trump-style republicanism. A lot of those are relatively small business people or own small professional practices or such. They make a lot of money, but they're not really at the commanding heights of the economy or the political system in any way. But then you have, the more mainstream, the big banks, the Fortune 500, and that's what used to be the core of the Republican Party. And with this, the gang of idiots and thugs who've taken over the Republican Party, that base doesn't really have a natural political expression to speak of anymore. So yeah, the Democratic Party, the Hillary Clinton style Democratic Party, really wanted to be and often was the political expression of that more responsible corporate class. But on the other hand, you have seen the rise of fairly left progressive wing within the Democratic Party that is challenging that dominance. Obviously Bill Clinton style politics really has no constituency to speak of anymore. And to watch Biden propose trillions and trillions of dollars of social spending is not something that the Clintons would ever have done. And it's partly because there is this vocal new wing of the Democratic Party that's forcing some kind of change. But they don't want it to change too much. That's interesting. There's this line from Tocqueville that the right used to like to talk about. They used to quote during the days of Gorbachev, when the USSR was reforming itself into oblivion, that the most dangerous time for a corrupt or tyrannical regime is when it starts reforming itself. So that gives me hope. If we see this kind of reformist tendency within the Biden crowd, then maybe that leaves them open to something much more ambitious and transformative.
Yeah, I like the idea of Joe Biden as our Gorbachev,
yes.
reforming the system into oblivion.